I stared at the email notification on my phone, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Nathan Wilson requests to connect with you on LinkedIn. 3 years since I'd heard from him. 3 years since the day he packed his bags. While I lay exhausted from my first round of chemotherapy, mumbling something about not signing up for this and needing space. Now here he was, popping up in my notifications like we were old college classmates who'd lost touch, not a husband, who abandoned his wife at her most vulnerable moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're not going to respond, are you? Maya asked, sliding a latte across my desk, her expression a mixture of concern and indignation. Maya had been my executive assistant for 2 years, but she'd become something more, a fierce protector, confidant, and the closest thing to family I had these days. He's only reaching out because BioRenewal stock jumped 30% after the FDA approval announcement. I smiled thinly, setting my phone face down. 42%, actually. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, San Francisco's skyline gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a view I'd earned through years of relentless work and determination. And no, I'm not responding. Not yet, anyway. Maya raised an eyebrow. Rebecca Morgan, please tell me you're not considering... I'm not considering anything, I interrupted, though the wheels in my mind had already started turning. Just, I keeping my options open. 3 years earlier, I had been a different Rebecca Morgan. At 35, I was a promising research scientist at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, passionate about my work developing treatments for autoimmune diseases. Nathan and I had been married for 7 years, living in a modest condo in Oakland that we'd purchased with the help of my parents. Nathan worked in finance, always chasing the next big opportunity, the next networking event, the next promotion. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We talked about children someday, but my career was just taking off, and Nathan always said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. The diagnosis came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Stage 2 breast cancer. Aggressive but treatable. The oncologist spoke with measured optimism about my prognosis, but all I could focus on was Nathan's face. The way the color drained from it, how his eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route, the tightening of his jaw when the doctor mentioned fertility preservation options. "We'll get through this together," he said in the car on the way home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I believed him because I needed to, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The first week after my diagnosis, Nathan was attentive, bringing me tea and researching treatment options online. By the second week, he was working late most nights. By the third, he wasn't coming home until after I'd fallen asleep. And then came my first chemotherapy session. I'd never felt so sick, so utterly depleted. I dragged myself from the bathroom floor, where I'd been vomiting for hours only to find Nathan packing a suitcase. "I can't do this, Becca," he said, not meeting my eyes. I thought I could, but I can't. This isn't what I signed up for. I remember sliding down the wall to the floor, too weak to stand, too shocked to cry. "What exactly did you sign up for, Nathan? In sickness and in health. Was that just words to you?" He zipped his suitcase with finality. "I'm not built for this. I'm not strong enough to watch you suffer, to watch you change." His eyes flickered to my hair, which would soon begin falling out. "I've subleased an apartment in the city. I need some space to figure things out." "Space," I repeated, the word hollow in my mouth. "And what am I supposed to do?" He had the audacity to look surprised by the question, as if he hadn't considered it. "Your parents can help, can't they? Or your sister?" "My parents lived in Arizona, retired on a fixed income. My sister was in the middle of a messy divorce with 2 young children to support. They could offer emotional support, but not the day-to-day care I would need. "I'll keep paying my share of the mortgage," Nathan added, as if that would absolve him. "Until you're better." I didn't cry until after he left. Then I cried until there was nothing left, curled on the bathroom floor, my body aching from both the chemicals coursing through it and the shattered pieces of my heart. 2 days later, a registered letter arrived from Nathan's lawyer. He wanted a legal separation. 6 months after that, divorce papers. He'd found an oversight in our prenuptial agreement that left me responsible for most of our shared debt while entitling him to half the equity in our condo. I didn't have the energy to fight it. Between the chemotherapy, radiation, and surgeries, I was barely surviving each day. My life became a cycle of treatments, side effects, and mounting bills. I took a medical leave from my research position, living on disability insurance that covered just enough to keep me afloat. My health insurance, thankfully, was excellent, a benefit of working in the pharmaceutical industry, but the incidental costs of cancer were overwhelming. Transportation to appointments, special foods I could tolerate, a wig when my hair fell out, medical co-pays that added up with each specialist. I sold my car, then my grandmother's antique jewelry. I moved to a tiny studio apartment when the condo was sold, Nathan taking his fair share of the proceeds despite contributing nothing to my care. On my darkest days, when the pain was unbearable and loneliness crushed me like a physical weight, I wondered if Nathan had been right to leave. Who would want to tie themselves to this? To a body betraying itself? To a future so uncertain? But alongside the pain and fear grew something else. Determination. A stubborn, relentless resolve that I would not merely survive this. I would emerge stronger. During the long hours of infusions, I began reading research journals again, keeping my mind active despite the chemo fog. Between treatments, I started jotting down ideas, observations about my own body's response to various medications. In the oncology waiting room, I met Diane Chen, another patient who happened to be a retired venture capitalist. We bonded over our shared experiences and our backgrounds in science and business. "You know," she said one day, examining the notes I'd made about my treatment, "there's something here. Your approach to analyzing immunotherapy responses is innovative." I shrugged. "Just trying to understand what's happening to my body. It helps me feel some control." Diane's eyes sparkled with something I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Belief. "No, Rebecca. This is more than personal observation. You've identified a pattern in immune response that could predict treatment efficacy. Have you considered how this might apply more broadly?" I hadn't, but Diane had. She introduced me to Dr. James Harrington, an oncologist at UCSF, with connections to the biotech startup world. He reviewed my research notes and offered me a part-time consulting position that I could perform remotely, working around my treatment schedule. "Your perspective as both a scientist and a patient is invaluable," Dr. Harrington told me. "You're seeing things from an angle most researchers can't." The consulting work paid modestly, but kept my mind engaged. More importantly, it gave me purpose during a time when my entire identity felt stripped away. As my health gradually improved, my involvement with Dr. Harrington's team deepened. By the time I finished my last radiation treatment, I had developed a preliminary algorithm for predicting patient responses to specific immunotherapy protocols. Dr. Harrington connected me with Eliza Washington, a brilliant software engineer, who'd lost her mother to ovarian cancer. Together, we refined the algorithm and built it into a usable interface for clinicians. We worked nights and weekends out of my tiny apartment, fueled by passion and the shared understanding of what was at stake. "You know, we could commercialize this," Eliza said one night, after we'd achieved promising results in our preliminary testing. "This isn't just a research project anymore, Rebecca. This could change how immunotherapy is administered." I hesitated. My energy was finally returning after months of treatment, but I still tired easily. Was I ready to take on something so ambitious? I don't have the capital to start a company, I said, gesturing around my sparse studio apartment. Eliza grinned. We don't need much to start, and I bet Diane would invest seed money. She was right. Diane not only invested, but helped us secure additional funding from angel investors who specialized in medical innovations. BioRenewal was born 18 months after my cancer diagnosis, operating out of a small incubator space in Oakland. Our breakthrough came when Memorial Sloan Kettering agreed to pilot our algorithm in a clinical trial. The results exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Patient outcomes improved by 27% when our technology was used to match them with optimal treatment protocols. From there, everything accelerated. We secured Series A funding, then Series B. We moved to a proper office in San Francisco. We hired a team of developers, research scientists, and medical advisors. I was no longer just surviving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was thriving. My cancer went into remission, and while I would need monitoring for years to come, my prognosis was excellent. 2.5 years after Nathan walked out, BioRenewal went public. The IPO was more successful than any of us anticipated, driven by compelling clinical results and a growing emphasis on personalized medicine in the healthcare market. Overnight, my stake in the company was worth millions. The studio apartment was replaced by a penthouse overlooking the bay. The medical bills that had once kept me awake at night became insignificant. And then, 3 years to the day since he'd left, came Nathan's LinkedIn request. I closed the LinkedIn app without responding and turned my attention back to the quarterly reports on my desk. BioRenewal was now partnering with 5 major hospital systems across the country. We were in talks with pharmaceutical companies about integrating our technology into their clinical trials. The work consumed me, but in a way that felt purposeful, rather than draining. That evening, as I drove home, my phone rang through the car's speaker system. Unknown number. Rebecca Morgan speaking, I answered, navigating through rush hour traffic. Becca. That voice. I nearly swerved into the next lane. It's me, Nathan. I pulled over, my heart racing. How did you get this number? Your company website lists you as the founder and CEO. It wasn't hard to find. He paused. You look amazing in the photos. Healthy, beautiful. My stomach tightened. What do you want, Nathan? To talk, to see you. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of work on myself. I made a terrible mistake, Becca. Which mistake would that be? My voice was surprisingly steady. Abandoning me during cancer treatment? Taking half the equity in our condo while I sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay medical bills? Or waiting until my company went public to contact me? That's not fair, he said, his tone taking on the defensive edge I remembered so well. I was young, I was scared. I didn't know how to handle what was happening. I was scared too, Nathan. I was terrified, but I didn't have the luxury of walking away. Can we just meet for coffee? 1 hour of your time. That's all I'm asking. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain was screaming to hang up, to block his number, to continue the life I'd built without him. But some small, wounded part of me, the part that still woke up reaching for him in the middle of the night, wanted closure. 1 hour, I agreed. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Verite Coffee on Market Street. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table in the corner, where I could see the door. I wore a tailored navy suit that my stylist had chosen for a recent Forbes photo shoot. My hair, now grown back thicker than before, pulled into a sleek chignon. Diamond studs that I'd bought myself after our first major funding round glinted at my ears. Nathan walked in exactly on time, scanning the cafe until he spotted me. He looked older, I realized with a start. Gray threaded his dark hair at the temples, and fine lines had formed around his eyes. He was still handsome in the conventional way that had first attracted me. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who'd moved through life largely unchallenged. "Becca," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Thank you for meeting me." "Rebecca," I corrected. "No one calls me Becca anymore." He nodded, accepting this small rebuke. "Rebecca, then. You look incredible." I didn't return the compliment. "Why are you here, Nathan?" He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug the barista had brought, him staring into it as if it might offer guidance. "I've been following your success. BioRenewal is making waves in the industry. What you've accomplished is remarkable." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "Though I'm curious why you're only acknowledging that now, 3 years later." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I deserve that. I've made mistakes, huge ones. When you got sick, I panicked. I convinced myself I was doing you a favor by leaving, that you didn't need the burden of my inadequacy on top of everything else. How convenient for you." "I know how it sounds," he said, leaning forward. "But I've changed. I've been in therapy for the past year, working through my fears of vulnerability, my tendency to run when things get difficult." He reached for my hand across the table. I pulled away before he could touch me. "I miss you, Rebecca. I miss us." I studied him, this man I'd once built my life around. Was he sincere? Possibly. People can change, grow, learn from their mistakes. But something about the timing felt too calculated. "What happened with Melissa?" I asked. Melissa had been Nathan's colleague, the woman he'd moved in with less than 2 months after leaving me. I'd learned about her from a mutual friend who thought I should know. Nathan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "We broke up 6 months ago. It wasn't right." "And your job at Meridian Partners? Last I heard, you were on track for partner." He shifted uncomfortably. "There was a restructuring. I'm between opportunities at the moment, consulting mostly." The picture became clearer. Nathan wasn't just here because he'd had some grand epiphany about lost love. He was here because his life had taken a downturn just as mine had ascended. I was no longer the desperate, sick woman he'd abandoned. I was a successful CEO with resources and connections that could benefit him. "I have a proposal," he said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "A business proposal, actually. I've been developing a financial platform specifically for biotech startups, helping them navigate the complex funding landscape. With your experience and my financial background, we could create something revolutionary." I accepted the document, skimming it briefly before folding it closed again. "So this is a business meeting?" No, he backpedaled, reaching for my hand again. This time I let him take it, curious about what he would do. "This is about us, Rebecca, about rebuilding what we had. The business idea is just a way we could work together, spend time together again." His hand felt strange against mine, once so familiar, now belonging to someone who felt like a stranger. I gently extracted my fingers from his grip. "There is no us to rebuild, Nathan. You made sure of that when you walked out." "People make mistakes," he insisted. "Haven't you ever done something you regretted?" I considered this. "Yes. I regret believing you when you said in sickness and in health. I regret not fighting harder when your lawyer took advantage of my weakened state during the divorce. I regret the years I spent loving someone who saw me as disposable when I became inconvenient." Nathan's face flushed. "That's not fair. I was dealing with my own issues." "So was I replied calmly. "I was dealing with cancer." An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Nathan finally broke it. his voice softening to the persuasive tone he'd often used when trying to convince me of something. "Just consider the proposal, Rebecca, and consider giving us another chance. We had something special once. We could have it again." I stood, gathering my purse. "I'll review your proposal as a professional courtesy. But Nathan, we were over the moment you packed that suitcase 3 years ago. Any chance of reconciliation died while I was selling my grandmother's jewelry to pay for medications while you were building a new life with Melissa." "Rebecca, our hour is up," I said, placing a $20 bill on the table for my untouched coffee. "I have a board meeting to prepare for." I walked out of the cafe with my head high, feeling lighter than I had in years. On the drive back to my office, I called my attorney, Claire Bennett. "Claire, I need you to review a document. It's a business proposal from my ex-husband." "Nathan?" Claire sounded surprised. We'd become friends after she'd helped me negotiate our recent partnership with Cleveland Clinic. She knew my history. "What's he proposing?" "A financial platform for biotech startups," I said, pulling into my reserved parking space at BioRenewal headquarters. "But I need you to look beyond the proposal itself. Check for any potential intellectual property concerns, any language that might entangle BioRenewal or me personally." "You think he's trying to get his hands on company assets?" "I think Nathan never makes a move without calculating the potential benefit to himself," I replied. "And I think his timing is suspect." Claire promised to review the document right away. Later that evening, she called back. "You were right to be cautious," she said. "The proposal includes clauses that would give him access to BioRenewal's client data and proprietary algorithms under the guise of financial optimization. There's also language buried in the middle about shared ownership of derivative technologies." I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still stung. He's trying to backdoor his way into my company. "Essentially, yes," Claire agreed. "This isn't a partnership proposal. It's a Trojan horse." I thanked her and hung up, staring out at the city lights from my penthouse windows. The view still took my breath away sometimes, a visual reminder of how far I'd come from that bathroom floor where Nathan had left me. The next morning, I instructed Maya to schedule a meeting with Nathan for the following day. "Put it in for 30 minutes, not a minute more." Maya raised an eyebrow, but didn't question me. "Where would you like to meet him?" "Here," I decided, in the main conference room. When Nathan arrived, he was clearly impressed by the BioRenewal offices. His eyes widened at the sleek modern design. The wall of awards and recognitions, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "This is quite an operation you've built," he said as I led him to the conference room. "You've come a long way from that research lab." "Yes, I have," I agreed, gesturing for him to take a seat. I remained standing, maintaining the power position. "I've reviewed your proposal, Nathan." His face brightened. "Great. I knew you'd see the potential. With my financial experience and your biotech connections, the proposal is a non-starter," I interrupted. Claire Bennett, our general counsel, identified multiple clauses designed to give you access to BioRenewal's proprietary technologies and client relationships. Nathan's smile faltered. "There might be some misunderstanding. Those clauses are standard in partnership agreements." "They're not standard, and this isn't going to be a partnership." I placed a folder on the table. "Between us. Inside, you'll find a cease and desist letter advising you against further attempts to access BioRenewal's intellectual property. You'll also find documentation of the funds you took during our divorce, funds that should have gone toward my medical care." He opened the folder, scanning the contents with growing alarm. "What is this? Some kind of shakedown? Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," I said calmly. "I'm setting boundaries. You left me at my weakest moment, Nathan. You took advantage of my illness to secure financial advantage for yourself. And now, when I've built something successful, You want to be part of it again. I made mistakes, he insisted, his voice rising. But this vindictive approach? It's not vindictive to protect what I've built, I cut in. It's just good business. The same kind of good business you practiced when you left your critically ill wife with crushing debt. Nathan stood, his face flushed with anger. You've changed, Rebecca. Yes, I agreed. Cancer changes you. Betrayal changes you. Building a multi-million-dollar company changes you. But do you know what the biggest change is? I leaned in. Slightly. I no longer measure my worth through your eyes. I no longer need your approval or validation. So this meeting was just to humiliate me? He demanded. This meeting was to make something absolutely clear. There is no path back into my life, personal or professional. What we had is over. What I've built is mine. As security escorted Nathan from the building, a precaution I'd arranged in advance, I felt no satisfaction, no vindication. Only a quiet certainty that I had finally closed a painful chapter of my life. That evening, I called Diane Chen, now a member of BioRenewal's board and one of my closest friends. Nathan showed up, I told her, curled on my sofa with a glass of wine, with a business proposal that was really a scheme to get his hands on company assets. Diane snorted. Of course he did. Men like Nathan always come sniffing around success they didn't help create. Tell me you showed him the door. I did more than that, I said, recounting the meeting. Claire drew up documentation of all the financial advantages he took during the divorce. If he attempts anything further, we're prepared. Good, Diane said firmly. Now, can we talk about something more important? The clinical trial results from Mayo Clinic came in today. Rebecca, they're even better than we projected. We spent the next hour discussing the trial results and their implications for BioRenewal's future. By the time we hung up, Nathan had receded to where he belonged. My past, not my future. The next day, I called an all-hands meeting. Standing before the 100-plus employees who had joined BioRenewal's mission, I felt a surge of pride and purpose. 3 years ago, I was fighting for my life, I began, my voice strong and clear. Today, we're helping others fight for theirs, with better tools and better odds than ever before. The Mayo Clinic trial results confirm what we've worked so hard to prove. Our technology is saving lives. The room erupted in applause. I saw tears in some eyes. Many on our team had personal connections to cancer, which fueled their dedication to our work. Next month, we're launching the BioRenewal Foundation, I continued. 10% of our profits will fund cancer treatment for patients without adequate insurance coverage. No one should have to choose between life-saving care and financial ruin. More applause, louder this time. As I looked around at these brilliant, committed people who had joined me on this journey, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, complete wholeness. Not because a man had returned to validate my worth, but because I had built something meaningful from the darkest chapter of my life. Later that week, I received a handwritten letter from Nathan. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, but felt none of the heart-racing anxiety his earlier contact had triggered. Inside was a brief note. Rebecca, I understand now that some bridges can't be rebuilt once burned. What I did was unforgivable, and your success without me is well-deserved. I won't contact you again. Nathan, I placed the letter in a box with other memorabilia from that chapter of my life. My hospital wristbands, the keys to our old condo, the divorce papers. Then I closed the box and put it away in a closet where it belonged. That evening, I hosted a dinner party in my penthouse. Diane, Eliza, Dr. Harrington, Maya, Claire, and a few other close friends who had supported me through both illness and recovery. As we raised glasses to BioRenewal's latest success, I looked around at these people who had seen my strength when I couldn't see it myself. To new beginnings, I toasted, and to endings that make them possible. Outside my windows, San Francisco glittered beneath a clear night sky. I had lost a husband but found myself. I had faced death and emerged with a deeper appreciation for life. I had transformed pain into purpose, betrayal into determination. Nathan had abandoned me when I was diagnosed. He had returned when my recovery made me wealthier than him. But neither his leaving nor his return defined me. What defined me was what I had built in between. Not just a successful company, but a resilient spirit, a meaningful purpose, and a life rich with genuine connections. That, I realized as laughter filled my home, was the greatest wealth of all. The first week after Nathan left was a blur of physical pain and emotional numbness. I existed in a state of suspended disbelief, as if any moment he would walk through the door, apologize for his temporary insanity, and resume his place in our life. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt with hope. But it was never him, just concerned friends, my oncology nurse checking in, or my mother calling for the third time that day, her voice carefully modulated to hide her fury at the son-in-law, who had abandoned her daughter. I had my second chemotherapy session scheduled exactly 2 weeks after Nathan's departure. My sister Jenna flew in from Chicago to take me, having arranged childcare for her kids and taken emergency leave from her job as an elementary school teacher. She arrived the night before, her face tight with worry when she saw me. 15 pounds lighter, dark circles under my eyes, skin sallow. The condo was in disarray. I hadn't had the energy to clean or even prepare the guest room properly. "Don't you dare apologize?" she said when I started to express regret about the state of things. "I'm here to take care of you, not judge your housekeeping." She dropped her bags and pulled me into a careful hug, as if afraid I might break. "Have you eaten today?" I couldn't remember. The days had begun to blend together, marked only by the severity of my nausea and fatigue. Jenna took charge immediately, ordering delivery, changing my sheets, and setting up a medication schedule on my phone with reminders. "Where's your paperwork?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on my bed while I picked at the soup she'd ordered. "Insurance, medical bills, treatment protocols. I want to get organized." I gestured vaguely toward my home office. "Everything's in there. It's a lot." She squeezed my hand. "That's why I'm here. Let me handle the logistics so you can focus on healing." The next morning, as Jenna drove me to the hospital, I could sense her restraining herself from asking about Nathan. Finally, as we sat in the oncology center waiting room, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Has he called at all?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I shook my head, focusing on the pamphlet about side effect management I'd been pretending to read. "What about money? Is he still contributing?" "He said he'd keep paying his half of the mortgage," I replied. "I haven't seen any money yet, but it's only been 2 weeks." Jenna's expression darkened. "And your medical expenses? Your lost income? Did he even think about that?" I hadn't either, to be honest. The shock of the diagnosis followed so quickly by Nathan's departure had left me in survival mode, taking each day as it came, each crisis as it arose. But Jenna's question triggered a cascade of worries. My health insurance was good, but the deductibles and copays were substantial. While on medical leave, I was receiving only 60% of my salary through short-term disability. Our savings had been modest to begin with, most of it tied up in the equity of our condo. "I think I need a lawyer," I said quietly, the realization settling in my stomach like a stone. Jenna nodded decisively. "Yes, you do. And not just any lawyer. You need someone who specializes in divorce cases involving medical crises. This situation isn't uncommon, unfortunately." I looked at her, surprised. "You know about this?" My sister's expression softened. "I did some research after you told me about Nathan. There are support groups online for people abandoned during serious illness. It's disturbingly prevalent. The nurse called my name before I could process this information fully. As the cold chemotherapy drugs began flowing into my veins, I tried to reconcile the man I'd married, the man who had held my hand through my father's funeral, who had nursed me through a severe case of pneumonia 4 years ago, who had promised to love me through better or worse, with someone who would walk away when I needed him most. By the time my third chemotherapy session arrived, Jenna had returned to Chicago, but not before setting up a system for my care. She'd organized a meal train among local friends, scheduled rides to my appointments, and most importantly, connected me with Patricia Donovan, a family law attorney who specialized in cases like mine. Patricia was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found reassuring. She'd been practicing family law for 25 years and had seen it all, she assured me when we met in her downtown Oakland office. "Unfortunately, what you're experiencing isn't unusual," she said, echoing Jenna's words as she reviewed the documents I'd brought. "Studies show that men are 6 times more likely to leave a marriage when their wife becomes seriously ill than women are when their husband falls ill." "That doesn't make me feel better," I said, attempting a weak smile. "It shouldn't," Patricia replied bluntly. "But it should convince you that this isn't about you failing as a wife or a woman. This is about Nathan failing as a husband and a human being." She explained that while California is a community property state, the circumstances of our separation could influence the court's decisions about support. "The fact that he left specifically because of your illness could work in our favor," she noted, making precise annotations on a legal pad. "Have you received any written communication from him expressing this?" I scrolled through my phone and found a text Nathan had sent the day after he left. "I just can't handle seeing you like this. I need space to sort through my feelings. This isn't what our life was supposed to be." I showed it to Patricia, who nodded grimly. "Save everything," she advised. "Texts, emails, voicemails. Document any verbal conversations immediately after they occur." "And Rebecca," she added, her voice softening slightly. "Prepare yourself. This process might get ugly, and it's coming at a time when you need to focus on your health." She was right about that. The chemotherapy was taking an increasingly harsh toll on my body. My hair began falling out in clumps during the shower. I finally asked a friend to shave it all off, crying silently as the last physical remnant of my pre-cancer identity disappeared down the drain. The nausea was relentless, and I developed painful mouth sores that made eating nearly impossible. I lost more weight, becoming a shadow of my former self. 2 months after Nathan left, I received the legal separation papers. His lawyer, Bernard Keller, was known for aggressive tactics in divorce proceedings. The document brazenly claimed that our separation was mutual and due to irreconcilable differences, making no mention of my cancer or Nathan's abandonment. It also contained a property division proposal that would have left me with significantly less than my fair share of our assets, while making me responsible for most of our joint debts. "This is predatory," Patricia said when we met to discuss it, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They're hoping you're too sick and exhausted to fight." I was sick and exhausted. There were days when even getting out of bed seemed an insurmountable challenge. When the thought of a protracted legal battle alongside my physical struggle was enough to make me consider surrendering. But something in me refused to let Nathan's betrayal be compounded by financial exploitation. "What do we do?" I asked Patricia. She outlined our counter-strategy. Document my contributions to our marital assets, including the fact that my salary had often covered household expenses while Nathan invested his income in his retirement accounts. Gather evidence of his abandonment specifically tied to my illness, and request temporary spousal support during the separation, given my reduced income due to medical leave. "It won't be easy," Patricia warned. "Keller will fight dirty. But I've faced him before, and I know his playbook." A week later, I was scheduled to meet with Patricia to finalize our response to the separation petition. That morning, I woke with a fever of 102 degrees. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, remembering the oncologist's stern warning. Any fever during chemotherapy could indicate a life-threatening infection and required immediate medical attention. The emergency room was chaotic, a cacophony of beeping machines, urgent announcements over the intercom, and the moans of fellow patients. I sat in a wheelchair, too weak to stand, clutching the information sheet from my oncologist. After an interminable wait, I was finally taken to an isolation room. Neutropenic patients like me, with compromised immune systems, were at high risk for catching additional infections in hospital settings. Blood was drawn, cultures were taken, and IV antibiotics were started. "We need to admit you," the emergency physician told me. "Your white blood cell count is dangerously low, and we need to monitor you closely until we identify the infection." "I have a meeting," I protested weakly. "An important legal meeting." The doctor gave me a look that combined compassion with firm authority. "The only meeting you're having is with our infectious disease specialist. Your body is fighting a serious battle right now." I was wheeled to a private room on the oncology floor, where nurses in masks and gowns checked my vital signs every few hours and administered a cocktail of powerful antibiotics. In my feverish state, I kept reaching for Nathan, forgetting momentarily that he wasn't there, hadn't been there for months. Each time the memory returned, it felt like a fresh wound. On my second day in the hospital, Patricia came to visit, bringing her laptop and legal documents. "If the mountain can't come to Muhammad," she said with a small smile, setting up a makeshift workstation on my adjustable bed tray. "You shouldn't be here," I protested. "I'm in isolation." She waved this away, pulling on the required mask and gown that a nurse had provided. "My immune system is excellent. Now, let's go through this response before you fall asleep again." We worked for an hour, Patricia patiently repeating explanations when my chemo-fogged brain couldn't keep up, adjusting language when necessary. By the time she packed up to leave, we had finalized our counterproposal to Nathan's separation terms. "I'll file this tomorrow," she promised. "You focus on getting well enough to leave this place." The infection kept me hospitalized for 5 days. When I was finally discharged, I was even weaker than before, barely able to climb the stairs to my condo. The medical bills from the hospitalization started arriving while I was still shuffling between my bed and the bathroom, managing only the most basic self-care. I spread them across my dining table, trying to make sense of the charges, the insurance coverage, the remaining patient responsibility. The total came to nearly $4,000 out of pocket. Money I simply didn't have, not with my reduced disability income barely covering my everyday expenses. With shaking hands, I called the number Nathan had given me for emergencies. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Nathan," I said after the beep, hating the tremble in my voice. "I've been hospitalized with an infection. The medical bills are substantial. I need to discuss financial arrangements with you. Please call me back." He didn't call. Instead, I received an email from Bernard Keller. "Ms. Morgan, my client has instructed me that all communications regarding financial matters should be directed through this office. Mr. Wilson is meeting his legal obligations by maintaining his portion of the mortgage payment. Any additional expenses related to your medical condition are your responsibility." I forwarded the email to Patricia, who called me immediately. "This is unacceptable," she said. "We'll address this in our petition for temporary support. How are you managing day to day?" I didn't have a good answer. My parents had sent what they could from their retirement savings, but it wasn't enough. My credit cards were approaching their limits. Friends had been generous with meals and transportation, but they couldn't pay my medical bills or mortgage. "I'm considering selling the condo," I admitted. "I can't maintain it physically or financially right now." Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's a significant decision to make while you're still undergoing treatment. If you sell now, in a rushed manner, and in this condition, you might not get fair market value. Is there another option? A home equity line, perhaps? We explored alternatives, but the reality was stark. I couldn't afford to keep the condo, not with mounting medical expenses and reduced income. A week later, I contacted a real estate agent recommended by a friend who had recently sold her home. Margot Wu arrived with market analyses and practical suggestions for minor improvements that would increase the condo's appeal without requiring significant effort or expense on my part. "The market is strong right now," she assured me, her eyes taking in my gaunt appearance and bald head with professional discretion. "We should be able to sell quickly at a good price." When I told Nathan about my decision to sell, communication again came through his lawyer. "Mr. Wilson agrees to the sale of the property, contingent upon receiving his fair share of the proceeds, as outlined in our previous correspondence." Patricia's response was immediate and forceful. Mr. Wilson's fair share must account for his abandonment of Ms. Morgan during her critical illness and his failure to provide adequate support. "We will be seeking an equitable distribution that reflects these circumstances." The legal battle intensified, even as my physical battle continued. I began losing track of which caused me more stress, the chemotherapy or the divorce proceedings. 4 months into my treatment, with the condo now on the market, I had a follow-up imaging scan to assess how the cancer was responding. I sat alone in the examination room, waiting for Dr. Patel to arrive with the results. The paper gown crinkled as I shifted nervously on the table, my feet dangling above the cold floor. When she entered, her expression was carefully neutral, the way doctors look when they're trying not to telegraph news before they've delivered it properly. "The chemotherapy is working," she said, pulling up the images on her computer screen. "The tumor has shrunk by approximately 60%. Relief flooded through me, so intense I felt dizzy with it. "That's good, right?" Dr. Patel smiled, her professional reserve softening. "It's very good. Better than we typically see at this stage. Your body is responding well to the treatment protocol." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not just that I might survive, but that I might someday move beyond mere survival to actually living again. I left the hospital with a lightness in my step that had been absent since my diagnosis. That evening, my phone rang with an unknown number. Assuming it was yet another medical billing office, I almost didn't answer. But some instinct made me swipe to accept the call. "Rebecca Morgan?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "Yes? My name is Melissa Davidson. I'm with Nathan." My body went cold, as if the blood had suddenly stopped flowing through my veins. "With Nathan," I repeated dully. "We've been seeing each other," she continued, her voice uncertain. "For a few months now. I work with him at Meridian Partners." Of course she did. Nathan had mentioned Melissa before, a financial analyst who had joined the firm last year. Young, ambitious, with a Stanford MBA. He'd spoken admiringly of her work ethic, her sharp intelligence. I had never suspected anything romantic, had never been the jealous type. Now the pieces clicked into place with nauseating clarity. "Why are you calling me?" I managed to ask, gripping the kitchen counter for support. There was a pause then. "Because I just found out about your situation. Nathan told me you two had been separated for nearly a year, that the divorce was already in process when you were diagnosed. He said you had pushed him away, that you refused his help." The lie was so profound, so completely inverted from reality, that I couldn't immediately formulate a response. Had Nathan truly rewritten our history so thoroughly? Had he convinced himself of this alternate reality where he was the wronged party? "That's not true," I finally said, my voice stronger than I expected. Nathan left 2 weeks after my diagnosis. He moved out while I was recovering from my first chemotherapy session. We had not discussed separation before my cancer. Silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, slightly ragged, as if she was fighting tears. "I found the paperwork," she said finally. "In his desk drawer. The real timeline, the diagnosis date, the legal separation filing. It didn't match what he told me." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked again. "Because it's wrong," she said simply. "What he did to you is wrong. And what he's doing now, trying to take half the value of your home while you're fighting for your life, that's wrong too." I sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. "Is he there with you now? Did he put you up to this call?" "No," she said quickly. "He's at a client dinner. He doesn't know I'm calling. Rebecca." She hesitated. "I have emails, messages between Nathan and Bernard Keller discussing strategy for the divorce. They specifically talk about using your illness to pressure you into accepting less than you're entitled to, knowing you won't have the energy to fight." My hand tightened around the phone. "Why would you share this with me? You're in a relationship." "With him." "Not anymore," Melissa said, her voice hardening. "I ended it tonight after confronting him with what I found. He didn't deny it. He just kept saying that you wouldn't find out, that Keller had assured him the strategy was legal if not entirely ethical." She paused. "I'm sending you everything. Check your email in an hour." After we disconnected, I sat motionless at my kitchen table, trying to process this unexpected development. An hour later, as promised, my email pinged with a message from Melissa. Attached were dozens of communications between Nathan and his lawyer, strategy discussions, financial analyses, even a document titled Leverage Points that explicitly mentioned capitalizing on health crisis and expedited settlement while capacity energy compromised. I forwarded everything to Patricia immediately, then sat back, a strange calm settling over me. The confirmation of Nathan's calculated cruelty should have devastated me, but instead, it crystallized something I had been struggling to accept. The man I had loved, the man I had married, either never existed or had transformed into someone unrecognizable. Either way, my grief for our lost relationship had been misplaced. You couldn't mourn something that was never real. The next morning, Patricia called, her voice vibrating with controlled excitement. "These documents change everything. They demonstrate bad faith negotiation and potentially rise to the level of exploitation of a vulnerable person. We're filing amended paperwork today." 2 days later, I received a call from Bernard Keller himself, the first direct communication I'd had from Nathan's side that wasn't a formal legal document. "Ms. Morgan," he began, his voice smoothly professional, "I'm calling to discuss the possibility of an expedited settlement in your separation from Mr. Wilson. Are you now?" I kept my voice neutral, though my heart was racing. "What prompted this sudden interest in resolution?" A slight hesitation. "My client is concerned about the prolonged stress of legal proceedings on both parties. He's prepared to offer a more generous division of assets than previously proposed." "How generous?" "Full equity in the condo to you, assumption of the key outstanding joint credit card debt by Mr. Wilson, and a lump sum payment of $25,000 to assist with your medical expenses." It was substantially better than their previous offer, which would have left me with crippling debt and half the condo's value. But it still didn't account for the emotional damage, the betrayal, the calculated exploitation that Melissa's evidence had revealed. "In exchange for what, Mr. Keller?" Another pause. "A standard non-disclosure agreement regarding the details of your separation and divorce, including any communications between Mr. Wilson and his legal counsel." Of course. Nathan was scrambling to suppress the damning evidence of his manipulation. I wondered if he was concerned about his professional reputation. Abandoning a sick wife wouldn't play well in the conservative financial circles he navigated, or if it was just his ego that couldn't bear being exposed. I'll need to consult with my attorney, I said, fighting to keep the tremble from my voice. I'll have Ms. Donovan contact you. Patricia was blunt when I called her. They're running scared. Those documents are damaging, not just in divorce court, but potentially to Nathan's career if they became public. The offer is better than where we started, but it doesn't reflect the full extent of what you're entitled to. What do you recommend? Counter with full equity in the condo, all joint debts assumed by Nathan, a lump sum of $50,000 for medical expenses, and monthly support of $3,000 for 2 years to help you rebuild. No non-disclosure agreement. That's their problem, not yours. I hesitated. The thought of dragging this out further was exhausting. I was halfway through my chemotherapy regimen, with radiation and possibly surgery still ahead. Part of me wanted to accept the offer, flawed as it was, just to be done with Nathan legally as well as emotionally. Rebecca, Patricia said gently, I understand the temptation to settle quickly, but remember what those emails revealed. They're counting on your exhaustion. They're banking on you not having the strength to fight for what you deserve. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my condo, moving from room to room, touching objects that held memories of my life with Nathan. The coffee table we'd found at a flea market and refinished together. The framed photo from our trip to Yosemite, both of us laughing as we hiked to Nevada Falls. The kitchen where we'd cooked Sunday brunches, dancing to 80s music while the French toast sizzled. Who had that man been? The one who'd spun me around the kitchen, who'd carried me across a stream so I wouldn't wet my hiking boots, who'd promised to grow old with me. Had he ever existed? Or had he always been a facade, a performance that crumbled when real adversity struck? By morning, I had made my decision. I called Patricia from the oncology center waiting room, where I was scheduled for my next chemotherapy session. Counter as you suggested, I told her. But add one thing. I want a formal acknowledgement in the settlement that Nathan left specifically because of my cancer diagnosis. No euphemisms, no irreconcilable differences. The truth. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's unusual in a divorce settlement. They'll fight it. Then we fight back, with everything Melissa provided. When the nurse called my name, I handed my phone to my friend Denise, who had driven me to the appointment. Patricia will explain, I told her, following the nurse to the treatment area. As the chemotherapy drugs dripped into my veins, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since Nathan walked out, I wasn't just reacting to his actions or their consequences. I was making a deliberate choice based not on what was easiest, but on what was right, for me, and perhaps for any other person who might find themselves abandoned in their moment of greatest need. Nathan's counteroffer came 3 days later. Acceptance of all financial terms, with a partial concession on the acknowledgement. He would admit to leaving during my illness, but objected to the specific wording that tied his departure directly to the cancer diagnosis. It's as close as his pride will let him come to the truth, Patricia observed. Do we push further? I considered what I truly needed from this process. Not revenge, not punishment, but accountability. And with the financial terms secured, I would have the resources to focus on healing without the constant stress of potential bankruptcy. Let's accept, I decided. But I want it stated clearly that he left 2 weeks after my diagnosis, while I was undergoing active treatment. The timing should speak for itself. The final settlement was signed a week later. Nathan never appeared in person. Everything was handled through our respective attorneys. The condo was now mine alone, though I was still planning to sell it. It had become more of a mausoleum to my failed marriage than a home. The lump sum payment would cover my accumulated medical bills and provide a small cushion for future expenses. The monthly support would allow me to focus on recovery without immediate financial pressure to return to work full-time. Most importantly, the settlement included the truth. Nathan Wilson acknowledges that he left the marital home on March 17th, 15 days after Rebecca Morgan's cancer diagnosis, while she was undergoing active treatment. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase the abandonment or heal the breach of trust. It didn't give me back the months I'd spent fighting on two fronts, against cancer and against Nathan's attempts to exploit my vulnerability. But it was something, a recognition, however grudging, of what had actually happened. The day after, the settlement was finalized. I went to the beach alone. It was a cool, foggy morning, the kind of San Francisco day that wraps you in a gray embrace. I walked barefoot along the shore, feeling the cold sand between my toes, the occasional wave washing over my feet. My body was thin and weak, my head covered with a silk scarf to protect my sensitive scalp. Yet standing there, listening to the rhythm of the waves, I felt a profound connection to my own resilience, to the strength that had carried me through the darkest period of my life. I thought about the day I'd met Nathan, 11 years earlier, at a financial seminar where I'd gone to learn about investing my first real paycheck. He'd been charming, attentive, seemingly genuinely interested in my work in pharmaceutical research. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of fancy restaurants, weekend getaways, and long conversations about our dreams for the future. He'd proposed after just 6 months, presenting a life plan that had seemed so solid, so secure. Had there been warning signs? Perhaps. His discomfort when I'd battled pneumonia 4 years ago, his awkward visits to my father in hospice, his general avoidance of anything related to physical vulnerability or mortality. But I had interpreted these as typical male discomfort with illness, not as predictors that he would abandon me when I needed him most. As I turned to leave the beach, I made a decision. I would not allow Nathan's betrayal to define my story. It was a chapter, a painful one, but not the whole book. What mattered now was writing the next chapters on my own terms. I had no way of knowing then how those chapters would unfold, that a chance conversation in an oncology waiting room would lead to a revolutionary medical technology, that the very experience that had broken my heart would ultimately open doors to a future brighter than I could imagine. All I knew, standing on that foggy beach with the taste of salt in the air, was that I had survived. Not just the cancer, which was responding well to treatment, but the collapse of the future I had planned, the loss of the partner I had trusted. I had survived, and in that survival lay the seeds of whatever came next. 6 months into my cancer treatment, I finally sold the condo. The real estate market had been kind. Margot's expertise and timing resulted in a sale price 15% above our initial asking. After paying off the mortgage, I had enough to secure a small studio apartment in a quiet building near the medical center and still maintain a modest financial cushion. Moving day was bittersweet. Jenna flew in again to help, this time bringing her oldest daughter, Emma, who at 12 was eager to be useful and distract her aunt from the emotional weight of the transition. We had hired professional movers for the furniture I was keeping, but the real work was sorting through the accumulated possessions of my marriage, deciding what to take into my new life and what to leave behind. "What about these?" Emma asked, holding up a stack of photo albums. She opened one to reveal images from Nathan's and my honeymoon in Maui. Smiling, tanned versions of ourselves posing on black sand beaches and beside cascading waterfalls. I paused my packing to study the photographs. The woman in those images seemed like a stranger now, carefree, secure in her husband's love, unaware of how quickly that security could crumble. I felt an unexpected surge of compassion for her. Naivety. "We'll store those for now," I decided, not ready to discard them but equally unwilling to give them space in my new home. Some memories need distance before we can make peace with them. Emma nodded with surprising understanding for her age. Like when Dad moved out, Mom put all their wedding pictures in the attic. She said maybe someday they'd just be pictures of a happy day instead of pictures that made her mad. Jenna, overhearing from the kitchen where she was wrapping dishes, gave me a rueful smile. Kids miss nothing, she said. But she's not wrong. Time does change how we relate to these things. By late afternoon, we had loaded the last boxes into the moving van. I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows I'd cleaned one final time, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. So many memories lived in these walls. Dinner parties with friends, lazy Sunday mornings reading. On the sofa, heated arguments followed by tender reconciliations. And the more recent memories. Endless days in bed battling nausea, friends bringing meals I couldn't eat, phone calls with lawyers negotiating the pieces of my broken marriage. "Ready?" Jenna asked softly, appearing at my side. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I locked the door for the final time, I felt a weight lifting, the burden of trying to rebuild a life in spaces haunted by abandonment. My new apartment was a blank slate, a single large room with a small kitchen alcove and a surprisingly spacious bathroom. The landlord had recently renovated, installing new hardwood floors and fresh white paint. The building had an elevator, crucial on my worst days when stairs were impossible, and a small rooftop garden where residents could sit on pleasant evenings. "It's cozy," Jenna declared as we supervised the placement of my carefully curated furniture. Just the essentials, plus a few pieces I couldn't bear to part with, like my grandmother's reading chair and the desk where I'd written my graduate thesis. "It's perfect," I corrected her. "It's exactly what I need right now. Manageable. Mine." That first night after Jenna and Emma left for their hotel, I sat on my new balcony watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled over San Francisco. My treatment had progressed from the devastating chemotherapy regimen to targeted therapy, which, while still taxing, allowed me more good days than bad. My hair was returning, a soft fuzz covering my scalp, surprisingly darker than my original, light brown. Dr. Patel was cautiously optimistic about my prognosis. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think beyond survival, beyond the next treatment or legal battle. What did I want for this new chapter of my life? What would recovery and rebuilding actually look like? The questions felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. My phone chimed with a text from Diane Chen, my fellow patient from the oncology center. "Settled in?" "Just watching the sunset from my new balcony," I replied. "How are you feeling?" "Good day today. Blood work improving. Still on for coffee Thursday?" I smiled. My friendship with Diane had become an unexpected blessing of this difficult time. At 62, she approached her own cancer journey with a pragmatism and dark humor I found refreshing after the walking on eggshells concern of many friends. Our weekly coffee dates had become anchoring points in the shifting landscape of illness and recovery. "Wouldn't miss it," I texted back. 2 days later, I met Diane at our usual cafe near the medical center. She was already seated at our preferred corner table, a steaming mug in front of her. Her short silver hair had grown back thicker than mine, giving her an elegant, distinguished appearance that matched her sharp intellect. "You look better," she observed as I joined her. "New place agreeing with you?" I nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "It feels like a fresh start. Smaller, but somehow more expansive, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense. Less square footage, more emotional space." She pushed a manila folder toward me. "I brought something for you to look at." I opened it to find research papers and financial reports about a small biotech startup. "What's this?" "Immunova Therapeutics. They're doing fascinating work with predictive algorithms for immunotherapy." Response: "Their approach reminded me of what you were telling me about your research before your diagnosis." Before my diagnosis. It seemed like another lifetime. Those days in the lab developing testing protocols for autoimmune treatments. I had loved my work, finding satisfaction in the methodical process of scientific inquiry, the collaborative problem-solving, the potential impact on patients' lives. Cancer had forced me to set it all aside. My mental energy consumed by treatment and survival. "I haven't thought about research in months," I admitted, skimming the papers. Diane watched me carefully. Maybe it's time to start. Not necessarily. Returning to your old position, but engaging with the field again. Keeping your mind active during recovery. I raised an eyebrow. Is this the retired venture capitalist talking, or the cancer patient? Both, she replied without hesitation. Cancer takes so much from us, Rebecca. It steals our energy, our plans, sometimes even our dignity. Don't let it take your passion, too. Her words stayed with me in the days that followed. During a particularly good stretch when the side effects of my treatment were minimal, I began reviewing scientific journals, catching up on developments in my field. It was like exercising an atrophied muscle, difficult at first, then increasingly natural as my scientific mind reawakened. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself sketching out ideas for refining immunotherapy selection protocols based on my own experience as a patient. The current approach relied heavily on trial and error, trying a treatment, waiting to see if it worked, switching if it didn't. This empirical method wasted precious time for patients whose cancers were aggressive. What if we could better predict which immunotherapies would be most effective for specific patients before treatment began? I started making notes, identifying variables that might influence response rates, genetic markers, previous medication history, comorbidities, even lifestyle factors. By dawn, I had filled a notebook with observations and questions, feeling more intellectually alive than I had in months. At my next appointment with Dr. Patel, I hesitantly mentioned my late-night brainstorming session. It's probably nothing, I said, self-conscious about my amateur patient perspective. Just keeping my mind busy. Dr. Patel surprised me by asking to see my notes. She reviewed them thoughtfully, her expression growing increasingly interested. This isn't nothing, Rebecca. Your approach is unconventional, but that's precisely why it's intriguing. You're thinking about this problem both as a scientist and as someone experiencing the treatment firsthand. She handed the notebook back to me. I'm speaking at a research symposium next month on emerging approaches to personalized oncology. Would you be interested in collaborating on a short presentation about these ideas? A theoretical framework at this stage, of course, but it could generate valuable discussion. I stared at her, stunned by the suggestion. I'm not even working in the field right now. I don't have access to a lab or data sets. But you have something equally valuable, insight, and I can provide access to anonymized patient data from our clinical trials. She paused, studying my reaction. Think about it. No pressure. I didn't need to think about it. The prospect of engaging with research again, of potentially contributing something meaningful from my experience, ignited a spark of purpose I'd been missing. Yes, I said. I'd like that very much. The next few weeks took on a new rhythm. Between treatments and recovery days, I worked with Dr. Patel on refining my observations into a coherent theoretical model. She connected me with a statistician from the research hospital who helped analyze patterns in the anonymized patient data, looking for correlations that might support or refute my hypotheses. I shared my progress with Diane during our weekly coffee meetings. She listened with growing interest, occasionally asking pointed questions that helped clarify my thinking. After one particularly animated explanation of a potential breakthrough, in our analysis, she set down her cup with deliberate care. You need funding, she said matter-of-factly. I laughed. I'm not looking to start a research project, Diane, just contributing to a symposium presentation. She fixed me with the penetrating gaze I imagined had intimidated countless entrepreneurs seeking her investment during her venture capital days. Don't be obtuse, Rebecca. What you're describing has commercial potential. If your predictive model works, it could significantly improve treatment outcomes and reduce healthcare costs. That's not just a symposium presentation, it's a business opportunity. I shook my head, uncomfortable with the suggestion. I'm still in active treatment. I can barely manage my own life right now, let alone a startup." "No one said you had to do it alone," Diane replied. "What about Dr. Patel? Or that statistician you mentioned? Robert, was it?" "Ryan," I corrected automatically. "You need a team, initial funding, a clear vision." She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "Let me introduce you to some people. Just conversations at this stage, no commitments." Before I could formulate a proper objection, she was already sending emails, her fingers flying across the screen with surprising dexterity for someone in her 60s. "There," she said with satisfaction. "James Harrington at UCSF has agreed to meet with us next week. He specializes in translational research, bridging the gap between academic findings and clinical applications." I felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with unexpected excitement. "Diane, I'm not sure I'm ready for this." Her expression softened. "None of us are ever fully ready for the opportunities that change our lives, Rebecca. But sometimes we have to say yes anyway." The meeting with Dr. Harrington was held in his office at UCSF, a surprisingly cluttered space for someone of his stature in the medical research community. Books and journals were stacked on every available surface, and whiteboards, covered with equations and diagrams, lined the walls. Ryan Lassiter, the statistician who had been helping me, joined us, bringing updated analyses of the patient data. Dr. Harrington listened intently as I explained my approach to predicting immunotherapy responses, occasionally interrupting with perceptive questions that pushed me to clarify my reasoning. Ryan presented our preliminary statistical findings, which, while limited by the sample size, showed promising patterns. When we finished, Dr. Harrington leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What you're proposing could significantly advance personalized oncology. The integration of multiple variables, genetic, physiological, behavioral, creates a more nuanced predictive model than anything currently in use." He paused. "It needs rigorous testing, of course. Expanded data sets, validation protocols." "Exactly," I agreed, relieved that he understood the preliminary nature of our work. "This is just a theoretical framework at this point." "But a compelling one," he countered. "Compelling enough to warrant development." He turned to Diane. "I assume that's why you're here, Dr. Chen. You've developed an eye for promising innovations." Diane smiled. "I may be retired, James, but I still recognize potential when I see it. What resources would be needed to take this from theory to validated model?" What followed was a detailed discussion of research requirements, potential, testing protocols, and development timelines. Ryan contributed ideas about advanced statistical methods that could strengthen our analysis. Dr. Harrington suggested potential collaborations with other research teams working in adjacent areas. By the time the meeting concluded, what had begun as a symposium presentation had evolved into the outline of a serious research initiative. Dr. Harrington offered access to UCSF's expanded patient database for further analysis. Ryan expressed enthusiasm about continuing to work on the project, and Diane, with characteristic directness, proposed forming a proper business entity to protect our intellectual property and pursue funding options. "I need time to think," I said as we left Dr. Harrington's office, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. "This is moving very quickly." Diane nodded, unexpected compassion in her eyes. "Take the time you need, but Rebecca, don't let fear of the unknown stop you from pursuing something meaningful. We both know how precious time is." The implicit reminder of our shared cancer experience silenced any further objections. We had both faced mortality in ways that forever altered our perspective. If this research could help future patients, avoid the grueling trial and error approach to treatment that we had endured, didn't I have a responsibility to pursue it? That evening, I called my sister Jenna. "Something unexpected is happening," I began, then explained the rapid evolution from personal observations to potential business venture. "Becca, that's amazing," she said when I finished. Are you excited? You sound hesitant. I sighed, trying to articulate the complex swirl of emotions. I am excited. The research is fascinating, and the team that's coming together is brilliant. But I'm still in treatment, Jenna. I have good days and bad days. Some mornings I can barely get out of bed. How can I commit to something this significant? Maybe the question isn't whether you can commit, she suggested gently, but whether you can afford not to. This matters to you. I can hear it in your voice. And from what you've described, it could matter to countless patients. What if I fail? What if my health deteriorates and I can't follow through? Then you adjust, scale back, bring in more support. But Becca, what if you succeed? Her voice grew more passionate. What if this becomes the work that defines your life after cancer? The meaning you create from an experience that otherwise just feels senseless and cruel? Her words struck a chord. Throughout my treatment, I had struggled with the arbitrariness of cancer, the lack of reason or purpose in such suffering. The opportunity to transform that experience into something beneficial for others offered a kind of redemption I hadn't realized I was seeking. You sound like Diane, I said with a small laugh. I like her already, Jenna replied. Listen to what she's telling you. Listen to your own excitement. The rest can be figured out. 2 days later, I met with Diane, Ryan, and a business attorney. She recommended to discuss forming a proper research entity. We outlined roles and responsibilities based on our strengths and availability. Ryan would lead the statistical analysis and algorithm development. I would direct the overall research approach and contribute my unique dual perspective as scientist and patient. Diane would handle business development and investor relations. What about your treatment schedule? Ryan asked with characteristic directness. In his early 30s, with a mathematician's precision and social awkwardness, he had never quite figured out how to discuss my cancer comfortably, but his concern was genuine. I have treatments every 3 weeks now, with recovery days following, I explained, but the schedule is predictable so we can plan around it, and the side effects are less severe than during chemotherapy. We'll structure everything to accommodate your health needs, Diane assured me. Flexible hours, remote work options. Your well-being remains the priority. The attorney helped us establish BioPatterns LLC, with equitable ownership divided among the 3 of us and provisions for additional equity for future team members. Diane provided initial seed funding from her personal investments, enough to cover basic expenses while we developed our research and sought additional financing. Dr. Patel was supportive of my new venture, offering continued access to anonymized patient data and introducing us to colleagues who might contribute to the research. Dr. Harrington became an informal advisor, providing invaluable guidance on navigating the complex intersection of academic research and commercial development. As word spread through Diane's extensive network, we began receiving inquiries from potential investors and collaborators. A small biotechnology incubator offered us subsidized lab space and administrative support. A prestigious medical journal expressed interest in publishing our preliminary findings once they were ready for peer review. The momentum was both exhilarating and terrifying. Each development pushed me further from the identity of cancer patient and closer to research entrepreneur, a transformation I hadn't anticipated when I first jotted down observations in my notebook during a sleepless night. Not everyone in my life understood this new direction. Some friends worried I was taking on too much during treatment, potentially compromising my recovery. My mother, visiting from Arizona, expressed concern about the stress of a startup. "Shouldn't you be focusing on getting well?" she asked, as we shared dinner in my small apartment. "This sounds like an enormous undertaking." "It is," I acknowledged. "But Mom, it's also giving me a reason to get well, a purpose beyond just surviving treatment. That matters." She studied me across the table, worry lines etched around her eyes. My illness had aged her, I realized with a pang. "You always were determined," she said finally. a reluctant smile softening her expression. Even as a little girl, once you set your mind on something. I get that from you, I reminded her gently. The symposium where Dr. Patel had originally suggested we present our work arrived in the midst of this whirlwind of activity. My presentation, now co-authored with Ryan and Dr. Harrington, generated exactly the kind of engaged discussion we had hoped for. Researchers and clinicians alike recognized the potential of our approach to revolutionize immunotherapy selection. One audience member, a stern-faced oncologist from Memorial Sloan Kettering, asked particularly challenging questions about our methodology. I addressed each one calmly, acknowledging the limitations of our current data while defending the fundamental soundness of our approach. When I finished, she nodded with what seemed like grudging respect. Later, at the reception following the presentations, she approached me directly. Dr. Morgan, I'm Eliza Washington from Memorial Sloan Kettering. I shook her extended hand, bracing for more criticism. Your questions were thought-provoking, Dr. Washington. Thank you for pushing us to clarify our methods. She smiled unexpectedly. Good science requires rigorous questioning. I was impressed by your responses. She paused, then continued more quietly. I was also struck by your integration of patient experience into the research framework. It's an element often missing from our work. Thank you. It's been illuminating to view the problem from both perspectives. I lost my mother to ovarian cancer 5 years ago, she said, surprising me with the personal disclosure. Her immunotherapy response was inconsistent, and we wasted precious months finding an effective protocol. Your work could prevent that experience for countless families. I felt a surge of emotion at the reminder of what was truly at stake in our research. That's our hope. I'd be interested in discussing potential collaboration, she continued, her professional demeanor returning. Sloan Kettering has extensive patient data that could help validate your model, and our computational oncology division has developed some algorithms that might complement your approach. This unexpected opportunity from one of the nation's leading cancer centers felt like validation of everything we had been working toward. We'd welcome that conversation, Dr. Washington. As the symposium concluded and I returned to my regular treatment schedule and research activities, I noticed a subtle but significant shift in how I viewed myself. The cancer was still there. I felt its presence in my fatigue, in the changes to my body, in the rhythms of treatment that structured my days. But it no longer defined me completely. I was Rebecca Morgan, cancer patient, yes, but I was also Rebecca Morgan, research scientist, innovator, entrepreneur. The scope of my identity was expanding beyond the narrow confines of illness, reaching toward a future I was actively creating rather than passively awaiting. 8 months. Into my cancer journey, at a routine follow-up scan, Dr. Patel delivered the news we had been hoping for. The latest imaging showed no evidence of disease. We both knew this didn't mean I was cured. Early-stage breast cancer could recur years after initial treatment, but it was the best possible outcome at this stage. You've responded remarkably well to treatment, she said, genuine pleasure, warming her professional demeanor. We'll continue with the maintenance therapy as planned, with regular monitoring. But Rebecca, this is very good news. I sat in her office, absorbing the significance of her words. No evidence of disease. 4 simple words that represented the culmination of months of brutal treatments, side effects, uncertainties, and fears. What does this mean for my prognosis? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. With continued maintenance therapy and monitoring, your 5-year survival probability is excellent, over 90% based on current data. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. You should feel optimistic about your future, Rebecca. Both your medical future and this remarkable work you're developing. I left the hospital in a daze, wandering to a small park across the street where I often sat after appointments. The late afternoon sun filtered through eucalyptus trees, casting dappled shadows on the grass. I called Jenna first, then my parents, sharing the good news through tears of relief and gratitude. My final call was to Diane, who had become both mentor and friend through this unexpected journey. "No evidence of disease," I told her, still getting used to the phrase. "Champagne tonight," she declared, her usual brisk tone softened by emotion. "My place, 7 o'clock. I'll invite Ryan too. He's been checking his phone every 10 minutes waiting for your results." That evening, as we toasted with fine champagne, on Diane's elegant terrace overlooking the bay, I felt a profound sense of transition. Not an ending. Cancer had taught me there were no guaranteed endings, but a passage from one state to another, from patient to survivor, from someone whose life had been interrupted to someone actively charting a new course. "To biopatterns," Diane said, raising her glass for another toast, "and to its brilliant founder, who saw opportunity where others would have seen only hardship." Ryan, awkward but sincere, added, "To changing how we approach cancer treatment, and to the surprising ways we find our purpose." I smiled at these unexpected partners on my new path. "To second chances," I said simply, "and making them count." Later that night, as I prepared for bed in my small apartment, I found myself thinking of Nathan for the first time in weeks. I wondered if he knew about my improving health, about the research venture that was gaining momentum. We had no direct contact since the divorce was finalized, but we still had mutual friends and professional connections. Did it matter what he knew or thought? Once, his opinion had been central to my sense of self. His approval, his admiration, his love defining my worth in ways I hadn't fully recognized until they were withdrawn. Now, I realized with quiet amazement, his perspective seemed increasingly irrelevant to the life I was building. The woman who had collapsed on the bathroom floor when he walked out, too sick and shocked to fight for herself, felt like a distant memory. In her place stood someone stronger, not despite the cancer and abandonment, but partially because of them, forged in that crucible of suffering into someone more resilient, more focused, more aware of her own capacity to endure and create. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan had left because he couldn't bear to witness my weakness, my vulnerability, my need. In doing so, he had missed the opportunity to witness my strength, my resilience, my rebirth. It was his loss, I realized, now, not mine. As biopatterns grew from concept to reality over the following months, our team expanded to include Eliza Washington from Memorial Sloan Kettering, who relocated to San Francisco to lead our clinical validation studies. We secured additional funding through a combination of research grants and private investment, allowing us to lease proper laboratory space and hire specialized staff. My role evolved from hands-on researcher to research director, overseeing the scientific vision while others managed the day-to-day experimental work. This arrangement accommodated my ongoing maintenance therapy and regular medical appointments while still allowing me to contribute meaningfully to the company's development. 18 months after my initial diagnosis, a year since the founding of BioPatterns, we achieved our first major breakthrough. Our algorithm successfully predicted immunotherapy response in a retrospective analysis of over 500 cancer patients, with 82% accuracy, significantly outperforming existing methods. The paper documenting our findings was accepted by the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious publications in medical research. The day the article was published online, I sat at my desk in our modest offices, staring at the screen with a sense of unreality. My name listed as lead author, our methodology detailed for the global scientific community, the potential impact on future cancer patients made tangible through statistics and case studies. Ryan appeared in my doorway, his usual awkwardness transformed by excitement. "We're trending on medical Twitter," he announced, holding up his phone. Prominent oncologists are already discussing implementation possibilities. I smiled at his enthusiasm. That's what we wanted, engagement from the clinical community. It's more than engagement, he insisted. It's validation. And Rebecca. He hesitated, rare emotion making his voice unsteady. What you've accomplished here, while still undergoing treatment yourself, it's extraordinary. His words touched me unexpectedly. In the rush of work and ongoing treatment, I rarely stepped back to acknowledge the improbability of our journey. From desperate patient to innovative researcher, from abandoned wife to company founder, from fighting for survival to potentially changing survivorship for others. That evening, we held a small celebration in our offices. The team had grown to 12 now. Researchers, data scientists, clinical coordinators, all united by belief in our mission to personalize cancer treatment more effectively. As I looked around at these brilliant, dedicated people, many of whom had turned down more lucrative positions to join our startup, I felt a sense of community I had never experienced in my previous research roles. "Speech!" Diane called out, tapping her glass with a spoon. The room quieted, all eyes turning expectantly toward me. I hadn't prepared anything formal, but as I stood before this team that had become a kind of family, the words came naturally. 2 years ago, I received a diagnosis that changed everything. Cancer has a way of stripping life down to its essentials, forcing you to confront what truly matters. For me, what emerged from that confrontation was this work, this opportunity to transform a personal nightmare into tools that might spare others some of the darkness. I paused, looking at each face in turn. What we're building here matters. The algorithm, the predictive model, the potential clinical applications, they matter. But equally important is how we're building it. Collaboratively, ethically, with patient experience at the center rather than the periphery. That approach isn't just good science, it's good humanity. Raising my glass, I concluded, to biopatterns. To all of you who believed in this vision, and to the patients whose lives we hope to change. The applause that followed felt like affirmation, not just of our professional accomplishment, but of the deeper transformation that had brought us to this moment, of wounds becoming wisdom, of trauma becoming purpose, of endings becoming beginnings. Later that night, as I drove home along the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco, I realized with sudden clarity that I had crossed an invisible threshold. The cancer would always be part of my story, as would Nathan's abandonment, but neither defined me anymore. They were chapters in a longer narrative that I was actively writing, day by day, choice by choice, creation by creation. The future stretched before me, not restored to what it had been before diagnosis, but transformed into something I couldn't have imagined then, something potentially more meaningful, more impactful, more authentically mine than the life that had been interrupted. What lay ahead remained uncertain, as all futures are. Cancer had taught me the futility of presuming tomorrows. But for the first time since that rainy Tuesday in the oncologist's office, the uncertainty felt less like threat and more like possibility. Not merely time to fill, but a canvas to create upon. Not just a life to resume, but a life to reimagine. 2 years after founding BioPatterns, the company had grown beyond our initial expectations. What had begun as a small research project operated out of subsidized incubator space was now a legitimate biotech startup with 28 employees, proper offices in the Mission District, and clinical validation studies underway at 5 major cancer centers across the country. I was sitting in our conference room, reviewing the latest validation data with Ryan and Eliza, when Maya, our recently hired administrative director, appeared in the doorway. "Rebecca, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a call you might want to take," she said, her expression suggesting this wasn't a routine matter. "It's Stanford Medical Center, Dr. Lawrence Torres from their Oncology Innovation Division." I excused myself, curiosity piqued. We didn't have any current projects with Stanford, though they were certainly on our list of potential partners for future studies. Dr. Morgan speaking, I answered in my office, settling into the ergonomic chair Diane had insisted on buying when she noticed me rubbing my back after long meetings, a lingering effect of the physical toll cancer treatment had taken on my body. Dr. Morgan, thank you for taking my call, Dr. Torres began. I've been following your work at BioPatterns with great interest, particularly the immunotherapy response prediction model you published in the NEJM last year. That's gratifying to hear, I replied. The professional satisfaction still fresh despite the growing recognition our work was receiving. Are you interested in joining our validation studies? Potentially, yes, but I'm calling about something more specific. He paused. We've recently received funding for a specialized research initiative focused on developing next-generation predictive tools for cancer treatment. The grant is substantial, $15 million over 3 years, with an emphasis on translating research directly into clinical applications. My pulse quickened. That level of funding could accelerate our work dramatically, allowing us to expand our studies and refine our algorithms faster than our current resources permitted. That sounds like an excellent initiative, I said cautiously, unsure where the conversation was heading. I'll be direct, Dr. Morgan. We'd like to discuss the possibility of Stanford acquiring BioPatterns, integrating your team and technology into our broader research program. The proposal caught me completely off guard. We had been approached by pharmaceutical companies interested in licensing our technology, but a complete acquisition hadn't been on my radar. I appreciate your interest, Dr. Torres, but we're quite committed to our independence and current development pathway. I understand that instinct, he said smoothly, but I'd encourage you to consider the advantages of joining forces with an institution like Stanford. Our resources, clinical access, and established pathways for bringing innovations to market could significantly accelerate your impact. Despite my initial resistance, I found myself intrigued by the possibilities. Our current funding, while adequate for our planned studies, wouldn't allow for the kind of rapid scaling that Stanford could provide. And wasn't the ultimate goal to get our technology to patients as quickly as possible? I'd be happy to discuss this further, I conceded, though I should be clear that any decision would need to involve my co-founders and consider our entire team. Of course, Dr. Torres agreed. Why don't we arrange a meeting next week? I'd like to give you a tour of our facilities and introduce you to the broader research team. Bring your co-founders. We want everyone comfortable with how this might work. After ending the call, I sat quietly, processing this unexpected development. When I had started BioPatterns, the goal had been simple: develop better tools for predicting cancer treatment responses, potentially sparing patients the grueling trial-and-error approach I had endured. I hadn't thought about exits or acquisitions, or how our innovation might ultimately reach the wider medical community. I gathered Ryan, Eliza, and Diane in my office to share Dr. Torres's proposal. Their reactions were mixed. Ryan expressed immediate concern about losing control of our algorithmic approach. Eliza saw potential benefits in terms of expanded clinical applications, and Diane, ever the experienced businesswoman, wanted more details about the financial and governance structures of the proposed acquisition. This is worth exploring, Diane concluded after a lengthy discussion. But we need to be clear about our non-negotiables before any meeting. What elements of BioPatterns' mission and methodology must be preserved, regardless of who signs the checks? It was the right question, forcing us to articulate what truly mattered about the company we had built. Over the next few days, we developed a framework for evaluating the Stanford proposal. Our technology must remain focused on patient-centered applications rather than being redirected toward more commercially lucrative but less impactful uses. Our core team must remain intact. And the patient perspective, my unique contribution as both scientist and cancer survivor, must continue to guide development decisions. The following week, we visited Stanford Medical Center's impressive research campus. Dr. Torres gave us a comprehensive tour of their oncology innovation facilities, state-of-the-art laboratories, computational centers with massive processing power, and clinical spaces where new technologies could be tested and implemented. The resources were undeniably beyond anything BioPatterns could access independently in the near term. We met with researchers working on complementary technologies, administrators who outlined how our team would integrate into the broader Stanford ecosystem, and lawyers who presented the initial terms of the proposed acquisition. The offer was generous: $30 million for the company, with guaranteed research funding of $5 million annually for 3 years, and leadership positions for all 4 co-founders. "We want this to be a true integration," Dr. Torres emphasized during our final meeting of the day. "Not an absorption. Your vision and approach are precisely why we're interested in BioPatterns." On the drive back to San Francisco, the 4 of us were uncharacteristically quiet, each processing the day's information through our own lens. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "The computational resources alone would advance our modeling capabilities." "By years," he said, tapping his fingers on his knee, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize. "But I'm concerned about the publishing restrictions they mentioned. Our work needs to be accessible to researchers everywhere, not locked behind Stanford's proprietary walls." Eliza nodded. "The clinical integration pathway is impressive, though. Implementing our technology in their oncology department could give us real-world feedback much faster than our current validation studies." "The financial terms are fair," Diane added. "Perhaps even generous for a company at our stage. But I noticed the earnout provisions are heavily weighted toward commercial applications rather than clinical impact metrics." I listened to their observations, grateful for these brilliant colleagues who caught details and implications I might have missed. But my own thoughts were circling around something more personal, more difficult to articulate. "What's your read, Rebecca?" Diane asked, noting my silence. "You've been quiet." I gazed out the window at the golden hills of the peninsula, searching for the right words. "I'm thinking about why we started BioPatterns, not just to develop better predictive tools, but to change how those tools are developed, with patients at the center of the process, not just as end users." I turned back to face my colleagues. Stanford has incredible resources and reach, but would we become just another research project there? Our patient-centered approach gradually diluted by institutional priorities and academic metrics? No one had an immediate answer. The question hung between us as we continued north toward San Francisco, each contemplating how our original vision might evolve or be compromised under Stanford's umbrella. Over the next 2 weeks, we engaged in detailed discussions with Stanford's leadership, negotiating aspects of the proposed acquisition that concerned us. They were accommodating on many points, agreeing to publication rights for our research, guaranteed autonomy for our core team, and modified performance metrics that emphasized clinical impact alongside commercial success. Yet something continued to nag at me, a reluctance I couldn't fully explain even to my closest colleagues. One evening, after another long day of negotiations, I found myself walking along the Embarcadero, watching the lights of the Bay Bridge shimmer on the water. My phone buzzed with a text from Jenna. "How's the Stanford decision coming along?" I had kept my sister updated on the potential acquisition, valuing her perspective as someone who knew me before cancer, before BioPatterns, before this new identity I had constructed from the ruins of my former life. Instead of texting back, I called her. "I should be excited about this opportunity," I said when she answered, skipping pleasantries. "It's validation of everything we've built. The resources to expand our impact. Financial security I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago." "But," Jenna prompted, knowing me well enough to hear the reservation in my voice. "But I keep thinking about what happens to our vision once we're part of something larger. Will we still prioritize the patient experience when we're answering to Stanford's leadership? Will we maintain the personal connection to our work when we're part of an institutional machine?" Jenna was quiet for a moment. "You're worried about losing control," she said finally. "After everything that happened with Nathan and the cancer, situations where control was taken from you. You've built something that's entirely yours, on your terms." Her insight struck me with unexpected force. Was that what this hesitation was about? Fear of once again having my agency undermined, my vision redirected by external forces? Maybe, I admitted. But it's not just personal. BioPatterns approaches the problem differently because of what I experienced as a patient. That perspective is our competitive advantage, our unique contribution. I worry it could get diluted. "Have you talked to other cancer patients about this?" Jenna asked. "People who might benefit from your technology? What would they want you to do?" It was a simple question, but it shifted my entire frame of reference. In all our discussions about the acquisition, we had consulted lawyers, financial advisors, and business strategists, but not the very people our work was meant to serve. The next day, I proposed something unconventional to my co-founders. A focus group of cancer patients and survivors to discuss the Stanford acquisition and its potential impact on our approach. Diane immediately grasped the strategic value, helping to recruit participants through cancer support networks she had built during her own treatment. A week later, 12 individuals gathered in our conference room, men and women of varying ages, cancer types, and treatment experiences. After explaining BioPattern's technology and the Stanford proposal in layperson's terms, I posed the central question: would our technology better serve patients as part of Stanford Medical Center or as an independent company? What followed was one of the most illuminating discussions of my professional life. These individuals, experts in the lived experience of cancer, offered perspectives that no business consultant or academic advisor could provide. "What matters isn't who owns the algorithm," said Michael, a 62-year-old lymphoma survivor. "What matters is whether patients like me can access it when we need it. Stanford might reach more oncologists faster than you can on your own." "But big institutions have bureaucracy," countered Aisha, a breast cancer patient currently undergoing treatment. "They move slowly. You're nimble now. You can adapt based on feedback, make changes quickly. Would you lose that at Stanford?" "The question I'd ask," offered Thomas, a soft-spoken man in his 40s, "is whether your voice, the patient's voice that inspired this approach, would still guide the development if you're one researcher among hundreds. Because that's what makes your technology different, isn't it? It was born from both scientific knowledge and personal experience." His question resonated deeply with me. It articulated the concern I had been struggling to define. Not just about control or credit, but about preserving the authentic patient perspective that gave our work its unique value. As the discussion continued, a pattern emerged in the feedback. These patients and survivors weren't opposed to Stanford's resources advancing our work, but they were concerned about maintaining the patient-centered approach that differentiated BioPatterns from conventional medical technology development. "What if there's a third option?" suggested Eliza as we debriefed after the focus group. "Neither full acquisition nor staying completely independent, but some kind of strategic partnership that gives us access to Stanford's resources while preserving our autonomy?" The idea took root. Over the following days, we developed an alternative proposal. Rather than selling BioPatterns outright, we would form a strategic alliance with Stanford, collaborating on specific research initiatives while maintaining our independent corporate structure and decision-making authority. Dr. Torres was initially skeptical when I presented this counter-proposal. "Stanford typically prefers clean acquisitions rather than complicated partnerships," he explained during our next meeting. "It simplifies governance and intellectual property considerations." "I understand that preference," I acknowledged. "But BioPattern's value comes largely from our unique development approach, the integration of patient experience with scientific rigor. We believe preserving that approach requires maintaining our independence while still benefiting from Stanford's remarkable resources. He studied me thoughtfully. This is important to you. It's important to the patients we serve, I corrected gently. We just completed a focus group with cancer patients and survivors. Their feedback was clear. They value our patient-centered methodology and worry it could be compromised in a full acquisition. Mentioning the focus group changed the tenor of the conversation. As a physician researcher, Dr. Torres recognized the significance of direct patient input, something too often overlooked in technology development conversations dominated by financial and academic considerations. I'll need to discuss this with the leadership team, he said finally. A strategic partnership rather than an acquisition would require a different approval process and funding structure. But, he added with unexpected warmth, I appreciate your commitment to maintaining the essence of what makes biopatterns valuable. The negotiations that followed were complex, involving detailed discussions of intellectual property rights, revenue sharing, research governance, and clinical implementation pathways. Stanford's legal team initially pushed back on our insistence on maintaining independent decision-making authority for core biopatterns technology. Our lawyers countered, with precedents from other successful academic corporate partnerships in the biotech sector. Throughout these negotiations, I found myself drawing on unexpected strengths developed during my cancer journey and subsequent divorce, patience during extended periods of uncertainty, resilience in the face of setbacks, clarity about my non-negotiable values even when compromising on peripheral issues. 3 months after Dr. Torres's initial call, we reached an agreement. BioPatterns would remain an independent company, but enter into a 5-year strategic research partnership with Stanford Medical Center. The partnership included $10 million in research funding, access to Stanford's clinical data and patient populations for validation studies, and collaborative development of implementation pathways for our technology. In return, Stanford would receive preferential licensing terms for clinical applications developed through the partnership and shared intellectual property rights for jointly created innovations. BioPatterns would maintain exclusive control over our core predictive algorithms while committing to prioritize clinical impact metrics alongside commercial objectives. The day we signed the partnership agreement, Diane hosted a celebration at her home for the BioPatterns team and key Stanford collaborators. As twilight descended over the bay, turning the water to burnished gold, I found myself on her terrace with Dr. Torres, both of us taking a momentary break from the festivities inside. I have a confession to make, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. When you first pushed back on the acquisition offer, I was irritated. In my experience, early-stage companies jump at the opportunity to be acquired by Stanford. Your insistence on this partnership model seemed unnecessarily complicated. I smiled, appreciating his candor. And now? Now I think it may be the most interesting aspect of our collaboration. He turned to face me directly. BioPatterns approaches problems differently, not just scientifically, but structurally. That perspective might be as valuable to Stanford as your technology itself. His words affirmed the decision we had made to maintain our independence while embracing collaboration. BioPatterns had something unique to contribute to the medical research ecosystem, precisely because we stood slightly apart from traditional institutional frameworks, informed by patient experience in ways that larger entities often couldn't replicate. As the partnership with Stanford took shape over the subsequent months, BioPatterns continued to evolve. We moved to larger offices to accommodate our growing team, now 35 strong and expanding. Our clinical validation studies progressed, with promising results that supported the fundamental premise of our approach. Patient outcomes improved significantly when immunotherapy protocols were selected based on our predictive algorithm rather than standard clinical guidelines alone. The Stanford partnership accelerated our progress, providing access to larger patient cohorts and more diverse data than we could have secured independently. Collaborative research teams formed around specific applications of our technology, bringing Stanford's domain experts together with BioPattern's algorithmic specialists and patient advocates. My role shifted again, from direct research leadership to strategic oversight, ensuring that our expanding projects remained aligned with our core mission. I still participated in key research decisions, but increasingly found myself focused on broader questions of implementation and impact, how our technology would ultimately change clinical practice and patient experience. This evolution brought new challenges. The larger BioPatterns grew, the more difficult it became to maintain the intimate, collaborative culture that had characterized our early days. New team members didn't share the foundational experiences that had shaped our approach. Stanford collaborators, while brilliant and committed, sometimes struggled to fully embrace our patient-centered methodology. I worked with Diane to develop explicit principles and practices that would preserve our unique approach even as the organization expanded. We instituted regular sessions where cancer patients and survivors shared their experiences with our entire team, ensuring that the patient perspective remained central to our work. We created decision-making frameworks that explicitly incorporated patient impact alongside scientific validity and commercial viability. These efforts required constant attention and reinforcement, but they kept BioPatterns true to its origins, even as it grew beyond what I had initially imagined. 3 years after my cancer diagnosis, 2 years after founding the company, and 1 year into our Stanford partnership, we reached a milestone I had once thought impossible: FDA approval for our first clinical application, a software tool that helped oncologists select optimal immunotherapy protocols for specific patients. The approval came with its own complexities. Implementing the technology in clinical settings required training, integration with existing hospital systems, and ongoing monitoring of outcomes. Hospitals and insurance companies needed convincing that the upfront cost of our technology was justified by improved patient results and potential long-term savings. But these were good problems to have, the challenges of success rather than survival. And unlike the existential threats of cancer and abandonment that had once consumed my life, these challenges energized rather than depleted me, offering opportunities to extend our impact rather than merely preserve what we had built. Throughout this period of growth and transition, I maintained the habits that had sustained me during treatment and recovery: regular checkups with Dr. Patel, careful attention to stress levels and physical well-being, and the support network of friends and family who had stood by me at my lowest point. My cancer remained in remission, though I lived with the knowledge that recurrence was always possible. This awareness, rather than paralyzing me with fear, provided a clarifying perspective on what mattered, both personally and professionally. Decisions that might once have seemed daunting now appeared straightforward when viewed through the lens of finite time and focused purpose. One rainy Tuesday evening, nearly 3 years to the day since my diagnosis, I was working late in my office, reviewing implementation data from the first hospitals to adopt our technology. A knock at my door interrupted my concentration. Looking up, I was surprised to see Ryan. It was unusual for him to still be in the office at this hour. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Everything okay with the Stanford data integration?" "The data's fine," he said, sitting down but immediately standing again, too restless to remain still. "This isn't about work, actually. It's..." He paused, running a hand through his perpetually disheveled hair. "I was getting coffee this morning at Verite and I saw Nathan, your ex-husband." The name landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of emotion I hadn't expected. I had thought of Nathan less and less as BioPatterns consumed my focus, his abandonment receding from central trauma to historical footnote in my personal narrative. "Oh?" I managed, unsure what else to say. He recognized me from the company website, I think, introduced himself, asked how things were going at BioPatterns. Ryan paced from the window to the bookshelf and back. I didn't say much, just that we were doing well. But then he mentioned he'd been following our progress, especially the Stanford partnership announcement. Said he always knew you'd do something meaningful with your research. I felt a complex tangle of emotions. Anger at Nathan's presumption, amusement at his attempt to retroactively associate himself with my success, curiosity about his current circumstances. He asked if you were still involved in day-to-day operations, Ryan continued. I said you were the heart of the company. Then he asked if you were seeing anyone. This last detail surprised me most of all. What did you tell him? Ryan looked uncomfortable. I said I didn't discuss my colleagues' personal lives with strangers. He seemed embarrassed then, said he shouldn't have asked. But before he left, he gave me his card, asked me to tell you he'd love to catch up sometime if you were ever interested. He placed a business card on my desk. Nathan Wilson, Senior Investment Advisor, Meridian Partners. The same firm where he'd been working when we separated, though apparently he'd received a promotion since then. Thanks for telling me, Ryan, I said, making no move to pick up the card. I wasn't sure if I should, he admitted. I know how painful that time was for you, but I thought you should know he was asking about you. After Ryan left, I sat staring at the card, memories surfacing that I had carefully packed away during the intensity of building BioPatterns. Nathan walking out while I was violently ill from chemotherapy, the manipulation during our divorce proceedings, the financial exploitation when I was at my most vulnerable. But alongside these painful recollections came a surprising realization. Nathan no longer held any emotional power over me. The woman whose heart he had broken, whose life he had upended, had transformed that devastation into something remarkable. I picked up the business card, turning it over thoughtfully. Nathan's interest in reconnecting now, after BioPatterns, had been featured in medical journals, after the Stanford partnership had made headlines in industry publications, seemed suspiciously well-timed. The same man who couldn't bear to witness my illness apparently had no trouble associating himself with my success. For a brief moment, I considered calling the number on the card. What would I say to the man who had abandoned me at my most vulnerable? Would I tell him about the night spent vomiting alone on the bathroom floor? The fear of dying with no one to hold my hand? The financial stress that compounded my physical suffering? Or would I tell him about what came after? The research breakthrough, the company formation, the lives our technology was beginning to change. Would I share with him the strength I had discovered in myself, the purpose that had emerged from pain, the community that had replaced the partnership he discarded? In the end, I did neither. I dropped the card into my desk drawer and returned to the implementation data, to the hospitals adopting our technology, the oncologists learning to use our predictive tools, the patients whose treatment journeys might be less harrowing because of work that grew from my own difficult experience. Nathan belonged to a chapter of my life that had closed. Whatever curiosity or regret had prompted him to reach out now could remain his to manage. My focus was elsewhere, on the present we had created and the future we were building at BioPatterns. The following week brought news that expanded that future beyond what any of us had anticipated. Eliza burst into my office without knocking, waving a tablet with preliminary results from our latest validation study at Memorial Sloan Kettering. The algorithm application for pediatric patients, she said breathlessly. The predictive accuracy is even higher than in adults, 92% concordance, with actual treatment outcomes. This could change everything for childhood cancers with immunotherapy options. The data was preliminary but compelling. Our approach, originally developed from my adult breast cancer experience, appeared even more effective in predicting treatment responses for pediatric patients, potentially sparing children the particularly devastating side effects of unsuccessful immunotherapy protocols. As Eliza outlined the implications and next steps, I felt a swelling sense of purpose that dwarfed any lingering thoughts of Nathan or the past he represented. This impact, this potential to transform suffering into solution, was the true aftermath of my cancer story, far more significant than the marriage that had faltered in its shadow. Later that day, in a leadership meeting with Ryan, Eliza, and Diane, we made the decision to prioritize the pediatric application, accelerating its development timeline even though the market was smaller than for adult applications. It wasn't the most commercially strategic choice, but it aligned perfectly with our founding mission: to reduce unnecessary suffering in cancer treatment by matching patients with the right therapies sooner. The financial projections will need adjusting, Diane noted practically. The pediatric oncology market is more limited, and insurance reimbursement models are different. But the impact per patient is potentially greater, Eliza countered. Children have more life years ahead of them, more to gain from optimized treatment selection. Ryan nodded, already typing rapidly on his laptop. We can modify the implementation pathway, design a specialized interface for pediatric oncologists. The core algorithm remains the same. It's the application that needs customization. I watched this discussion unfold with profound gratitude for these partners who balanced practical considerations with humanitarian purpose, never losing sight of the patients whose lives our work would affect. We'll make it work, I said finally. If the data holds an expanded validation, we prioritize the pediatric application. Some opportunities transcend standard business calculations. As we adjourned, Diane lingered behind. Once we were alone, she fixed me with her characteristic direct gaze. Ryan told me about running into Nathan. I sighed, unsurprised that my co-founders discussed this development amongst themselves. They had witnessed the aftermath of my separation, even if they hadn't known me during the marriage itself. It's not important. I agree, Diane said, surprising me. But I wanted to observe something. 3 years ago, that encounter would have dominated your thoughts, disrupted your focus, perhaps even made you question your worth. Today, it's barely a footnote in your week, overshadowed by pediatric cancer applications and implementation strategies. She smiled, a rare softening of her typically businesslike demeanor. That's how I know you've truly healed, Rebecca. Not because the cancer is in remission, though I'm profoundly grateful for that, but because the people who once defined your sense of self no longer hold that power. You've become the author of your own story, rather than a character in someone else's. Her insight struck me with unexpected force. She was right. The most significant recovery I had undergone wasn't physical, but existential. The shift from a life defined by others' validation to one guided by internal purpose and chosen connections. Nathan had left because he couldn't bear to witness my vulnerability, my need, my reliance on his support. In doing so, he had inadvertently freed me to discover strengths I might never have recognized within the comfortable confines of our marriage. The company I had built, the lives our work was changing, the future we were shaping, none of it would exist if he had stayed. It was an irony too profound to be bitter. His greatest betrayal had ultimately led to my most meaningful contribution. In abandoning me when I was diagnosed, he had unwittingly set in motion the circumstances that would make my recovery more valuable than anything we might have built together. As Diane left my office, I turned back to the pediatric data, immersing myself in the details of our next challenge. Outside my window, rain began to fall over San Francisco, the droplets racing down the glass like tears, not of sorrow, but of release, washing away the last lingering attachments to a past that had served its purpose in bringing me to this present. The woman Nathan had left, frightened, diminished, defined by her illness and his rejection, no longer existed. In her place stood someone else entirely, a leader, an innovator, a survivor who had transformed personal catastrophe into collective possibility. Someone whose worth was no longer tied to another's approval or presence. Someone who had discovered that the worst thing she could imagine, abandonment in her darkest hour, had ultimately revealed the best of who she could become. The rain intensified, blurring the city lights into watercolor smudges against the darkening sky. I watched it for a moment, appreciating its cleansing quality, before turning back to my work, to the future being born from the remnants of what had been lost, to the lives that would be changed because one life had been broken and remade, stronger at the mended places than it had ever been before. 5 years to the day after my diagnosis, I stood at a podium in a crowded hotel ballroom, accepting the Breakthrough Innovation Award from the National Cancer Institute. The audience, physicians, researchers, industry leaders, and patient advocates, applauded as I approached the microphone. 5 years ago today, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. I sat in an oncologist's office and heard the words that forever divided my life into before and after. You have cancer. What followed was both the darkest chapter of my personal story and, unexpectedly, the catalyst for the work we celebrate tonight. The faces before me blurred slightly as I continued. BioPatterns began not as a business plan or research proposal, but as a patient's desperate attempt to make sense of chaos, to transform suffering into something meaningful, to ensure that future patients might have clearer paths through the bewildering forest of treatment options. Our technology was now implemented in over 200 hospitals nationwide. The pediatric application had received expedited FDA approval, becoming our most impactful innovation despite its smaller market. Independent studies confirmed what our initial validation had suggested: patients whose treatment protocols were guided by our predictive tools experienced better outcomes, fewer adverse effects, and significantly improved quality of life during treatment. Success is typically measured in metrics: market share, revenue growth, return on investment, I acknowledged. But the true measure of what we've built lies in metrics no spreadsheet can capture. The child who returns to school months earlier than expected, the mother who maintains enough strength to hold her newborn, the grandfather who lives to know his grandchildren. As I spoke, I noticed unexpected movement at the back of the ballroom. Someone entering late, trying to slip in unobtrusively. Even at a distance, I recognized him immediately. Nathan, older now, his dark hair threaded with silver, but unmistakably, the man who had walked out when the future seemed darkest. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded room. I felt nothing. No anger, no vindication, not even curiosity. Just a quiet recognition of a connection that had once defined me, but now registered as merely biographical, like the city where I was born or the college I had attended. Facts without emotional charge. I returned my attention to my speech without missing a beat. The journey from patient to innovator is not one I would have chosen, but it has taught me that our deepest wounds, when approached with courage and purpose, can become the source of our most profound contributions. Later, at the reception that followed, I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and discussing potential collaborations. My team surrounded me: Ryan, Eliza, and Diane, along with newer members who had joined our mission along the way. I caught glimpses of Nathan hovering at the periphery, perhaps waiting for an opportunity to approach. Maya appeared at my elbow, protective as always. "That's your ex-husband by the bar," she murmured. "Want me to run interference?" I smiled, touched by her loyalty. "No need. The past has no power here." When Nathan finally made his way toward me, I met his approach with professional courtesy. "Nathan, I didn't expect to see you tonight." "I've been following your work," he said, his voice carrying the familiar cadence that had once been the soundtrack of my daily life. "What you've accomplished with BioPatterns. It's extraordinary, Rebecca." "Thank you," I replied simply. "I've often wondered," he began, then hesitated, "if things had been different between us." "We'll never know," I interrupted gently but firmly. "And it doesn't matter now. The path that brought me here required everything that happened, including your departure." His expression registered surprise, then a reluctant understanding. I suppose that's true. Dr. Harrington from Stanford approached, saving us from further conversation. Rebecca, there's someone you must meet, the new director of oncology. At Mayo Clinic is interested in expanding your pediatric protocols to their satellite centers. With a nod to Nathan, a cordial goodbye to a chapter long closed, I turned toward the future that continued to unfold before me, rich with purpose and possibility. The life I had rebuilt from abandoned ruins had become more beautiful, more meaningful than the one that was taken from me. Not despite the breaking, but because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.